So what we're going to do now in this next session is we're going to talk a little bit about how to use MISP and how to interact with the interface and so on. So until now we've talked a lot of theory, but we've actually not seen MISP so far. But before we get there, there's still one part we have to chew our way through, which is a basic description of the data model. So the idea behind this is just to explain what kind of data you're going to be dealing with, what the various fields do, just a very quick overview. So as Alexander already mentioned, the most important thing what you're sharing, or the thing that is common to everything that you share, is the event. So the event itself is a container with the metadata. Here's just some of the fields that you can share with an event. One of the most important things that you have to do whenever you're creating an event is describing what the data that is going to be contained within actually is meant to achieve. Keep in mind that you might start out small with your own internal MISP only for internal purposes, but you might join a larger community later down the line. Something that we've seen, and this is something that is causing a lot of confusion at times, is people, for example, putting internal ticket numbers as a description of an event. So that is great for your internal housekeeping, not so great whenever you're sharing with the community later on. So if someone gets a ticket number, not very relevant. So be concise, but put something in there that makes sense for the community. Okay. Something that is common to all the elements that we're going to be dealing with here is that they have a distribution level. So both events, attributes, and objects, so the three main objects that we're exchanging, have that. Basically, these decide who can see the information and where the information will flow from your MISP out. So these two things are slightly different in a sense that one of the things that you have to decide is the flow of information. The other is, during those flow, who can see it on the various nodes that MISP reaches. So these are all controlled via the distribution level. We're going to see how that works more during the day. Another thing is that all information created in MISP has an owner. So that means that any event that you see out there has a creator organization behind it. These are uniquely identified across different MISP instances. So that means that if you're 7 hops away from the CIRCL instance, you will still get data in through those different hops if they're interconnected, coming from CIRCL marked as CIRCL data. Generally in MISP, you are not allowed to modify any data created by someone else, but you may propose changes to it. So this is also something that we're going to talk a little bit about later on. But the important thing to keep in mind is events have a creator organization that define who is the one that is responsible for the event, who can edit it. Then each of these events is made up of a list of attributes. So again, these are those atomic points of data that could, for example, describe an IP address. It could be a malware sample. It could be something like a car plate number if you're in one of those communities. So basically, the data is described in a tuple of 4 fields generally. One of them is the value, so that's the atomic value itself. For example, the IP address. The category describes why this is relevant, in what context this IP address was seen. For example, it is a network activity, it was used in payload delivery, and so on. And then you have the type, which basically tells the user or other systems that this IP address is in fact an IP destination, it's an IP source, it's an MD5 hash, and so on. Sometimes this can be a little bit confusing. For example, if you're thinking about hashes, hashes can have various different uses despite having the same format. So for example, a file hash will be very different from a certificate hash, and so on. And you can already describe some of this context via the type. We don't always separate them out, but in cases where the usage would be very conflicting in a sense that you expect very different tools to take care of the data, we separate them into separate types.
Like IP source and IP destinations.
Yep.
So you can describe an IP as a source or either as destinations.
Yep. Apart from that, there is also a contextual comment for each of the attributes. Keep in mind that even though you might only be feeding the data at first to feed your IDS and your SIEM or whatever tools you have internally, you're also probably going to share with humans out there that are reading the data. So whatever context you have, it might not help you with your IDS use case, but it might help an analyst sitting somewhere that is tracking a threat actor. So whatever information you have that you cannot describe in a structured way, just put it in there.
And that's quite important in MISP. Basically, the information that you populate in MISP can be either human consumed or machine consumed. And that's something that you have to keep in mind. Sometimes some producer of data are only producing data for machines or sometimes only for human. But in MISP, we support both. So sometimes it might be challenging for some analysts to analyze some data because they are lacking contextual information.
Mm-hmm. Then each time an attribute is created, MISP will check whether that attribute exists already in the system. So this is what we call a correlation. It's either a direct match of something that's already existing, or another attribute that through the correlation engine is deemed to be close enough to be a match. An example would be, for example, fuzzy hashing. If you have another file sample that you also have the SSD value of, then depending on the thresholds you've set up in your system, MISP might flag it as a correlation if there's a high enough overlap. Same thing with, for example, CIDR blocks. If you have an IP address and an IP range, and the address is within the range, it will create a correlation in that case as well. Okay. Additionally, this is something that Alexander's already touched on before. With this whole collaborative aspect, one of the things that we tried to do was being able to circumvent this whole ownership question of events. So even if you don't own an event, you should be able to add something to it and say, okay, I have additional information. I would like to share this back to the community. And this is where this proposal system comes in. So if you look at the graph itself, it looks very similar to an actual attribute. And the reason for that is that it's basically a blueprint for an attribute to be created or for an existing attribute to be modified. So you can either attach a proposal to an event saying, I want this event to have some additional information that I have found, for example, in my network, through my feeds that I'm subscribing, and so on. Or you can say, I see that you've published this information, some of it is incorrect, could be further enhanced, and here are the proposals to modify those existing attributes. One of the most typical use cases for this is basically just saying, okay, this is a false positive, just get rid of the IDS flag on this one. I don't want you to basically pollute everyone's networks with this.
Or for example, you have a report from an antivirus vendors containing a list of IP addresses and one is mistyped from the report. And then people propose a change to this typographic error.
It could be something like that, or it could be something that that your automatic processes basically picked up as a mistake. One of the most typical use cases is you're just encoding PDF reports that you get from vendors quickly, and you accidentally put the vendor's URL in there as well, which was somewhere in the report referencing their own site. So if you have that in there, that's of course not an indicator, even though it was indeed in the report. So that's a false positive in that case. So stuff like that happens. Yes?
Does the original creator of the event need to do any additional steps to make sure? So to be able to do that, you need to make sure that you get the data back in your own MISP.
Exactly.
So only a feeder or people are only doing a read-only of you.
Yeah. Then they will never get it back, indeed.
So it's a very good point. So you really need to be within a community where you can reach out to the creator organizations, indeed.
Yeah, and for example, indeed, if one of the links in the chain got the information through a feed, for example, which is read-only, then there is no way to convey that message all the way back to the original creator. Then it cannot be acted upon.
A lot of people don't still see the proposal.
Yes, everyone sees a proposal. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. The problem with that is that proposals by default will not go to your tools. So the exports completely ignore proposals, because very often you will have proposals in there that are conflicting. For example, the only exception that we make is unsetting the IDS flag, because sometimes it's basically almost an emergency to basically remove the IDS flag from something if it's a false positive. So what we do is you have a system setting in MISP, and you can say any proposal that you get in an attribute that says unset the IDS flag, I want to adhere to those and just not push it to my devices. So you can use that as an override. But you cannot use proposals as an override in the sense that if it corrects a value, if it adds an additional attribute, those will not go to your tools.
Another way to convey information to other parties without having the approval of the vendors or the creators is to basically create an extensions. So if you have an extended event, you basically have your own event that gets carried on over the different MISP, and this one it will be linked to that event.
So one of the things that we've seen very often is you get a report in and you do your own analysis in addition, but you cannot modify the existing report. You could create a proposal, wait for someone to accept it. That might never happen. So what we decided to do is you can create your own event and say, latch this one onto the original event and use this as an extend event. So that means that if you go to the original event, you have a button now that says, just show me the full thing with all the extensions, and it merges the list of attributes into one list. So you can do that. Of course, the downside with that is if you see an existing attribute that you want to override, it won't do that for you. So you cannot say, this one is wrong, I use an extend event to remove it. So then you have to use the proposals.
Yeah.
Okay? So, yes?
Can the system of extended events be used to merge events for different, for example, we have
Yes.
events that come from a different MISP that relates to the same.
Yes,
Yeah.
what you could do is you could create one event and just say that this one is extended by all those events. So you could do it that way. The only downside, of course, is that whenever you want to export that to other tools, they will be exported as separate events. However, there is a flag that you can set in the API, say just give me everything in extended format, and then you're going to get the full thing merged. So yeah. Of course, this might lead to some conflicting information, for example, in them, but that's, of course, a given if
But
you have.
it's a good point because you can either use it for example, you have a report from a third party that you want to modify, but indeed, if you have different tools and you want to combine them, it works too. But it's still different JSON files, but they are still all reference to the different ones. So yeah, well, we can do a demo of the extended event.
Yeah, sure. Okay, some other things that are interesting here, and this is still what MISP was like very long time ago, was we figured out that, okay, we would like for users to be able to add more than just technical information in there. So besides the comments, there was no way to really contextualize data. So what we came up with was a very simple system that was basically simple string tags. So that means that you could label any event that you had and say, okay, this is related to this or that, or put any markings on it, for example. And one of the things that we initially noticed that this was an utter disaster. We expected people to, for example, put TLP tags on events. And what we found was that human creativity has no bounds. You can write TLP green in at least 7 different ways, with a dash, with a double point, spaces, and so on. So we figured, okay, this is not something that we can live with for a very long time. So we came up with this whole taxonomy system, which is basically a blueprint system for different tags. That means that if you want to describe TLP, we have a TLP taxonomy, and you can just take the label from that taxonomy and use that. We still allow for free text tags, in addition to the ones coming from taxonomies. We see some use cases, for example, if you have an internal tool and you just want to tag something to be fed to a different tool and use as a filter, by all means create a tag and use it. But for anything that exists in a...
yeah, nowadays, if you look at on one of our communities, 80% of the tags are coming from the taxonomies.
Yeah.
So we see that people are commonly switch over from using free tagging at basically selecting the tag from the taxonomy.
The free text tags are really becoming the edge case. One of the things that we also encourage users to do is, if you cannot describe what you want to do via the taxonomies that we have, propose your own. Either use it then internally and distribute it out of bound with your partners, or share it back to us, to the larger community. When you're going to take a look at the taxonomies that we have, you're going to see that we have some very specific ones for certain communities in there, because we want them to be able to distribute it via the standard channels to their users. That doesn't mean that anyone else outside of them will use it. If you're an administrator of MISP, you're going to see how you can basically drive the contextualization process within your community by enabling and disabling certain taxonomies. So we're going to see that during the administration part. Then this is the more up-to-date version of what our data model looks like. Besides taxonomies, we've gotten a whole new system called galaxies, which allow you to basically also contextualize data like you would with tags and taxonomies, but to also provide metadata along with it. So for example, before what people were doing is, if they wanted to describe something that was related to APT29, they put the APT29 label on it, which was fine, but if your partner receives that and has no idea what APT29 is, then they're in a bit of trouble there. So what we try to do with Galaxy is having a massive standard library of things that you can describe. So we have a massive threat actor library with synonyms, suspected country of origin, references to articles about them and reports about them, and so on. And then instead of just assigning the label, you're assigning this full object that exists out there. You can, of course, create your own. So they're basically JSON blobs that you create, but then you need to share it out of bound with partners.
we have often questions, when should we use tags and when should we use galaxies? It's very easy. If you can express it in a tag, use a galaxy. That's basically it. So tags are basically simple key values, and if you cannot express it as a simple key value, go for galaxy, and then you can express meta information and stuff like that. So you have a lot of examples, but extending it is very easy. You can just create your own files and just add more information.
Mm-hmm. And some of these galaxies are coming from local communities, for example, that are asking for certain things that they can express. But sometimes we're just translating existing libraries out there. So this is where, for example, attack might be interesting. We highly encourage you that if you're describing TTPs, to use attack, because everyone is moving in that direction. It just makes sense to use something standardized. It's also a very cleverly designed framework. So we have a mapping of that and the tool that we're going to see later on how to use that allows you to quickly assign attack patterns to the various indicators.
Yeah, and the nice aspect is basically even if attack is really a specific model, behind the scene is just a galaxy. So we carry it like a normal galaxy. You can even really have multiple models. So we are not bound to one model. So if you really like the diamond model, for example, you can still mix diamond models and miter attack within the same event.
Yep. And then another thing, and this is the last subject that is interesting here, is the MISP object format. So this is the templating system that we have. What we found very often was that the more complex the information that we were getting into MISP via sandbox, via detection tools, and so on, the more of a difficulty we had to separate the data out into its own clusters within an event. That means that, for example, if you're describing the execution of malware, and it included several dropped files that you're also describing, you had this kind of jumbled mess with a list of flat list of attributes in your event, and you didn't really know what this hash belonged to, what did this additional information belong to. So instead what we came up with was this container system where you can say this is a file object. A file object can have optionally a file name, one of several different types of hashes, file size, and so on. And then you create this object. Now the thing that we were struggling with at first was how do we come up with a standard list of objects that makes sense for the community? We already had disagreements at the very earliest stage when we came up with the system. So in the first whiteboard brainstorming, we already had difference on how we would want to describe certain types of things. So what we ended up deciding was to go for something more relaxed. Basically, these interconnected attributes that we have in the object system are pretty loosely defined. And in the end, when you're feeding your tools, all you're really interested in is these two things belong together, and these two things are a file hash of this type, and for example, a file size. You're not really interested in the way you add additional context to it, for example, what kind of additional fields you want to have in there. So we left it up to the communities to start defining objects. We, of course, have a standard list of objects that we think make sense. But if you want to create your own, it's as easy as creating a simple JSON file. We have the templates for it and so on that you just have to use. Your only constraint is basically that you have to use the basic building blocks that we have via attributes. Again, if you're missing something there, let us know, and we are very quick with adding new attribute types. So that's we don't really have any roadblocks in our way. If we see something makes sense, we can add overnight for you. So just let us know. Okay. So that's basically it for the data model. Any questions to this part before we move on? Because if any of the objects or the fields wasn't clear, yes.
What about creating new objects and the problem of consumers not having the right templates?
Right. So that's a very good question. Something that comes up very often is indeed you run the risk of a consumer having a tool that reads a very specific type of object and feeds it to into a different tool. So if I expect a file object that has certain fields that I'm expecting, and I want to convert it to something else, if I get a file object in a custom object where it is slightly differently described, I'm going to struggle with it if I have an automated tool. On the other hand, something that we've seen very often is people will, for example, look for any object that has a file hash in it that is marked for automation as something malicious, and say, okay, I'm interested in this together with these other pieces in there. I don't care about the template. As long as these certain pieces of data are contained, I can convert it. So it's a different strategy on how you're converting it. With one strategy, where you're literally translating an existing template with known lists of fields, you're indeed going to run into troubles with custom objects. On the other hand, sometimes you want to do it. It also depends a little bit on your community. and what kind of data you want to convert.
Maybe it's mentioning the template things. If you have two different versions of the template, so that's another thing.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah. So sometimes you might have data that you receive, but you don't have the template. So with MISP, you can still read it, but the only thing that you cannot do is to edit it. So if you don't have any template for a specific object, it's still fine. MISP will be able to read it. So you will see it, you can even consume it, use it. But the only drawbacks, if you don't have the template, you cannot edit it, which is basically the only aspect.
In the end, think of the templates this way. It does have some metadata and some context, but in the end, it's really ended together attributes of something that you're defining. So basically, you're saying that this thing has this hash, it has this size, it was seen at this time, and so on. So depending on what you're ingesting, you might not really care about the template itself as long as your data points exist within. Okay? So any other questions before we have a look at MISP itself? No? Okay. So this is when you log into MISP, this is the first thing you're going to see. Whoops. I just want to see whether I'm logged out yet. No, it's fine. So when you log in, you're going to see a list of events. So the index that you get when you log in contains one event per line. What you can see here is usually the metadata that is most interesting for users at first glance to have an idea what they're actually dealing with here. So generally, we have the producer of the data. That's the first column. The second one is only available to administrators, and it's not that interesting. Then we have a local ID for the event, and this is something that will come up very often with MISP. Most objects in MISP have two IDs. One is a local ID, which is a numeric incrementing ID, and the other is a UUID. UUIDs remain the same across instances. So if you know the UUID of an event, you can go to a different instance, enter the UUID, and check if they have the event as well. So that is completely unique. However, the local IDs are unique to your instance only. So this is something that you have to be a little bit careful of whenever you're writing your own scripts. If you, for example, want to just aggregate data from 5 different MISPs, it's better to deal with UUIDs than with IDs. On the other hand, it is much easier when you're interacting with humans to talk about a simple numeric ID, and I have a much easier time telling Alexandre, for example, to look at event 11,500 than reading out this UUID and waiting for him to actually find the correct one. So this is just something to keep in mind, that you have these two things. All of the actions that you can undertake with an event or with an attribute or an object can be done either via the ID or the UID. So if you're looking at the documentation of the API and you see that there is an event ID field that expects either the local ID or the UID, and both will work. Okay. Apart from that, we have a list of tags and clusters here. So here we have an example of an attack pattern. So this is coming from the enterprise attack pattern library that is attached to this event. So what this says is that this event is contains a pattern exploitation for privilege escalation and PowerShell exploitation. So basically, this is a way to contextualize the data already. So if you're looking for certain types of data, you can use the cluster and tag information to filter on that already. So for example, if I would be interested in everything related to scam, I just click on scam, and it's going to use that tag as a filter and show me all the events that are related to it. Okay. And then we have some additional metadata. How many attributes does it contain? How many correlations do we have on these? These are all optional, by the way. So by default on MISP, you don't have those enabled, I think. But you can enable those additionally. The email address is only shown to site administrators. So we're in a bit of a privileged position here, being logged in as a site admin. Normally that is not visible to users. So we never disclose email addresses normally to users. And then you have the info field, which is probably the most important part of the index. When you look at it, you want to see, okay, I'm interested in a certain topic. Let's have a look at the events that are talking about that topic. Okay, so let's have a look at an actual event here. For example, which one should we pick? Wow,
the first one.
First one, okay.
The first one.
So we have a sextortion event here. It has a bunch of tags already classifying the information. So it says it is TLP green. So we also have our own classification schema where we basically say the classification of this incident is a spam and so on. So this already gives us an idea of what we're dealing with without actually having seen the actual indicators within the event. Apart from that, we can already see what kind of sightings are attached to the event, when it was last modified, and so on. So a bunch of metadata. The other interesting thing here is that we already see that we have a correlation in here. That means that some data in this event was already seen in a different event before. So if we hover over that, we get some more information about it, and we see that it's another sextortion event. That means that if you're getting indicators in and you're just pasting it into an event, based on the correlation, you immediately get context out of it. And you say, oh, this was already seen in a sextortion event. Let's have a look at that and see what the commonalities are. Is it really something that tells me that this current event has to do with the same topic as the other one? And if yes, then you already have a good starting point in your analysis. Okay. And then if we scroll down, we see the actual indicators below. So here we have a bunch of Bitcoin addresses that have some metadata around it. So we can see that these Bitcoin addresses were seen as part of financial fraud. So Bitcoin addresses we only have in that category. We can have comments in there. And what we see immediately is, again, correlations. So we see that this Bitcoin address was already used in a sextortion case. So that already gives us some idea about it. What Alexander's already talked about with the sightings before is right now we don't have any sightings on this event, but you could mark each event with a thumbs up and thumbs down. You want to do it?
Yeah,
okay.
this one is fine.
Okay. So we now added a sighting to this one. We already get a little graph there, which would look different if we would have more sightings. So historically, of course. But basically, with this, we've just said we've seen this somewhere already. Of course, this is really tedious to do by hand. So the idea is this is also API exposed. If you have, for example, for IP addresses, a seam that will automatically just trigger everything that that you see in there, that's also an option. Okay. Maybe no objects in here. Let's find a different one.
Is it possible through the API to identify that you have already tagged it as a
Yes, I don't know if it's well defined, but indeed you can search for the ID of an attribute and see the existing sightings, and then each of the sightings have an organization attached to it, and if it's yours, then yeah. But sometimes you might want to cite it more than once, so it's not necessarily something that you only want to cite once, because each sighting has a timestamp attached to it. So if something is still active, you might want to build a historic view out of it.
Yeah, for example, for the sextortion case, if we receive like 4 tickets with the same Bitcoin address, we can just say, okay, we see it 4 times, seeing that maybe one of the Bitcoin address has been more used on the others.
Yeah, an interesting tool that we have with this is the mail to MISP tool. Does that exactly with spam. So what happens is each time an indicator that already exists comes in a new spam email, it marks all the existing ones already with a sighting, so that we can see, for example, okay, this has been seen 2,000 times already, and then we can even draw a timeline between which times it has been seen. Maybe we get sometimes, for example, already parked domains being reused again after a longer break. So you get some interesting time-based correlations out of that as well. Okay, so let's go back here. Let's find a different one actually. Oops, that has objects in it.
You want to create an object?
Well, we can just go straight for creating one. So let's have a look at how to actually create an event and then go from there. So every time you create an event via the UI, that is, it starts with creating the container itself as a first step. As you can see, the form for creating an event is very simple. So if you want to follow this part, by all means, if you have the VM already installed, just play with and try the same thing as well. What you can see here with the metadata that you can fill out is you basically you just have to define a proposed date. So this is something very lax on purpose. We want to just have this based on the context that you're sharing. So if you're, for example, describing a sandbox execution, then the date would basically mean the execution of the sandbox. However, in some cases, the date might mean something different depending on what you're describing. So,
as an example, you receive a report from an antivirus vendor, and you know that they basically did the report based on an incident that they analyzed like 2 months ago. Then you set the dates 2 months ago to be sure that you have basically the timeline of the event.
Yeah, this is something very loose, and basically it's just supposed to deal as a first guideline of if you're dealing with something very old or something recent. It's not the most accurate measure either. Then you describe the distribution. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the near future, but basically something to keep in mind is MISP has two different systems for distributions. So this is the field that defines who gets to see the data and who gets to receive the data. One of them is basically based on distance, saying only I can see it, everyone on my current instance can see it, everyone on all directly connected instances can see it, and so on and so forth. So that's the distance-based one. And then the other one is basically a distribution list. That's something we call sharing groups. These are reusable groups that include a list of organizations that are involved in the sharing, along with a list of communities that are involved in the sharing. So you can use either of those methods depending on what you prefer. So in some cases, you might want to be very restrictive and say, I only want to exchange with 3 other partners that are out there because they were involved in an incident and I don't want anyone else to know about it. You can absolutely do that using sharing groups. Or you might want to say, everyone in, for example, this community should be able to see this event, and you can use the distance-based distribution method. Then we have 2 fields that are a little bit subjective, of course. One is the threat level. This is a highly debated field because what may appear as low to someone might be a very high threat level to someone else. So it is.
Yeah, and technically this kind of information usually now should be conveyed through Galaxy, through tags and so on. So it's there for historical reason, but it has not that much meaning, I would say.
Yeah, if you leave it all on undefined and just describe it via tags and galaxies, I think everyone's better off anyway. Yeah. The analysis level, this is more of a courtesy field saying that I'm still working on it. Don't consider it as final information. I'm just at the initial part of my analysis. I will add more information, but it's also one of those things that is not that important. Now, this field after it is the most important part, event info. This is where you're describing what you're dealing with here, and again, this is very. This might seem like something very straightforward, but it is where we have the most issues when people are starting out with the sharing. Again, anything that is internal references and so on, not a good idea to put in there if you're going to share the event. Another thing is be concise. The reason why we've made that field so small, it used to be much bigger than that, and it was a text field where you could paste entire essays in there literally, was we had the issue of people putting technical indicators in there. Keep in mind, if you put any technical indicator in a text field, it will not be parsed, it will not be sent to tools. People can still read it, but they won't be able to use it directly. So make sure that this is really just describing the intent of the thing. The other thing is you might be interacting with different types of communities where they have a different understanding of what you're doing. Please make sure to be as universally understandable as possible here. So if you have a secret squirrel club lingo that you use, if you're going to share it out with the wide community, it might not be a good idea to use that. So just something to keep in mind. The extended events we're going to see a little bit later on. If you want this event to be attached to another event and say this one extends the information contained with another, this is where you would put the local ID or the global UUID of that event in there. So let's just create a small test event that is only visible to our organization so we don't spam the actual live instance. And create our event. So now we have a barebone event created. This one has some metadata pre-filled based on what we've just done, and it has absolutely no attributes or objects or anything contained within. This is your starting point. MISP will already warn you, this event has no attributes. Please don't publish it because you're just sending an empty envelope out there. To populate the event, you have a lot of different tools. So as Alexandros mentioned, we're trying to cater to very different types of use cases and very different types of users. One of the things that you will very often do is indeed get a report in and just try to encode it as quickly as possible in MISP. So this is where you have the free text import tool. So if you go to populate from and then click free text import tool, you get this little text field where you can paste whatever text blob you have in there, and MISP will try to figure it out what it's dealing with. So for example, I have you have any text that you paste in there, you click submit. MISP will try to parse it. It will say, oh, I found a domain in there, google.com. I found an IP address in there, 8.8.8.8. These could be indicators. And then it says, okay, I've seen this in many different places. It's kind of scary how many times we have 8.8.8 in there, but it's probably coming from test events like this one during the training?
Sometimes.
Some not, sadly, but that's a different question.
So you can explain the warning list.
Hmm?
You can explain the warning list after.
Yeah, we can do it after. Wait, that's why I did this one. Yeah. What MISP cannot do for you in this case is resolve which one of several possible options was meant in here. It can give you a best estimate. For example, an IP address can be an IP destination or an IP source. What MISP will do is, most often IP destinations are shared, so it's probably that, but not necessarily sure about that. So it will give you a list of all the valid options based on the parsing rules in there. And then you select what is most appropriate at this stage. You can also say that, okay, google.com, I know that is definitely not something I want to have in there, so you just click it away and then it won't save that. Once you're satisfied with the changes that you've made, so you've said, okay, this one should go to the IDS because I think this is a very highly malicious IP address out there, and you set the distribution rules, maybe you've added some comments. Once you're done, you can just go to the bottom and click Submit Attributes, and MISP will then take that as an input and create an event out of it. That's going a bit slowly. What's going on there? So MISP has now added our highly malicious attribute here, and it's already warning us that something is wrong here. So what it's doing is it's checking against the warning list and saying, whoa, this is already containing two warning lists out there. So public DNS resolvers, and we have a separate IPv4 public DNS resolver list. So it warns us that this is potential false positive. Also at the top of the event, you'll get a little box saying, warning, there's a potential false positive in there. Now, this has two uses. One, it's supposed to notify analysts saying, this is something that you probably shouldn't push to your tools because it's an obviously a false positive out there. And then the other thing is that the analyst that's creating the event might ignore it and share it anyway. The other use of the warning list is you can use this as a parameter in all of the APIs and say, exclude everything from the exports that trips over one of these lists. That means that even if I share this information out there, most people that are using the APIs correctly and feeding their tools correctly will not be affected at all because they already use the enforced warning list flag, and it will be filtered out of any export when they're feeding an IDS, for example. Okay. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to edit it. So every list that we have in MISP has some action buttons on the right. That's where you edit things. So that's what I'm doing right here. And I can say, okay, I've seen this information, but it should not be sent to any of the exports automatically. I unflagged it, I click submit, and then the attribute is edited. Don't know what's going on with it's being so slow now, but okay. Another thing that is interesting at this point is that immediately when you enter something, you see the correlations out there. So as Alexander has mentioned, something that might happen is, besides the fact that in this case we found an obvious false positive, you might already have a lot of information about something out there, which leads you to different decision branches basically in your workflow. Either you say, okay, this is something that everyone knows about already, let's just discard this anyway and stop working on this. It's already something known. Or maybe you just use it as a basis of getting additional context on the data that you've already got in your hands right now. So that's up to you. Once you've entered the data and you've decided to keep it, you can start adding context to it. Again, context comes from two different sources, either taxonomies and tags, or via galaxies. So tags are very simplistic. You just click on this little plus icon in the tag field, and then you get a list of the various taxonomies that you can choose from. So again, we have a lot of taxonomies enabled in our instance, but depending on how your administrator runs your instance, you might only have one or two options. If you want to pigeonhole your users into using some taxonomies, it has a lot of advantages. Then you won't see a list like this. But let's say that we want to use the PAP taxonomy, which basically is something like TLP, but describing what you can do with the information. So if you hover over it, you're going to get an explanation of that. Ember says, for example, passive cross-checks are allowed. So if I want to say, okay, this is what I want to tag it with, just click it and it will attach the tag to the attribute. Okay, there we go. And it's the same idea with galaxies. So galaxies are just a different library. If you want to attach an attack pattern, you can click on the attack library, Here, let's choose a pattern, and you get the attack browser. If you're familiar with the attack navigator, we've tried to model it very similarly to that. So the idea is that if you're familiar with one, you're kind of familiar with the other. And then you just select the template that you want to add, and you click submit, and then it will be added to the attribute. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Again, this is just an example for attack. You can also use MISP galaxies that will use a different UI for selecting the galaxy that you're after. Mix and match the different libraries to be able to define everything that you want to describe to your community.
And the galaxy are available at the event level, so you can add it at the event level too.
And this is something that comes up very often. Yeah. Sometimes you will have an event with 10,000 attributes in there. So you have a massive list of IP addresses that you've collected from a tool, and you want to share that out. Now, something that we've seen is when people want to tag all of them, for example, TLP green, they will go through each individual event attribute to the script and create 10,000 tags. Please don't do that. By default, everything that is tagged on event level is assumed to be inherited by all the attributes contained within. So if you mark an event TLP green, everything within is also thought of as TLP green, and the filters will work that way. So when you have the decision of either tagging on the attribute or event level, always consider, is this the exception within the event, or is this something that defines all the attributes in there or most of the attributes? If it's the latter, do it on the event level instead. Okay? Right. So now we've seen how to add attributes the simple way via the free text import. Of course, the downside of this is that it's not some massive AI sitting behind it figuring out what all those indicators are. It's a very simple algorithm actually that runs a bunch of regex checks against it. So there is no black magic behind it, and sometimes it will miss stuff. So if you want to have more control over what you're inputting, you can input attributes manually. Just click the little plus button here, and you're going to get this interface up here where you select the category, you select the type, and so on. So you have the most control over this interface. Of course, it's also more tedious. It takes more time. If you have different IP addresses, domains, and so on to add, you have to go through the same form several times, paste all the values into the field, add it, and so on. So it's a question of having more control versus being faster. Depending on the use case, you might use one or the other. It is very simple to use. You have a list of categories. If I want to describe another IP address, I just select the appropriate type and the category. Keep in mind, some types only exist in some categories, so not every type is available in every category. Of course, you cannot describe Bitcoin for payload installation, for example. Makes sense. So just adhere to the rules given by the system. Again, you can set the distribution level, and then you can enter a value. Now, something that comes up here very often, and we see some frustration with the system, is people adding IP addresses one by one and having to go through this whole thing over and over. There is a batch import button, and then you can paste a massive list of IP addresses here, for example, all lines separated, and it will count each line as a separate value. Okay. Again, IDS flag, you can set it or not, depending on what you want with the attribute to happen. And maybe a small note to take here is that thing on the bottom there, which is a GDPR notice. So this is an optional feature that you can enable. And then GDPR is just the first library we have for the notification system. You can write your own. So if you want to, for example, write a notice list for, that warns users if they're inputting any financial indicators in there, to be careful before inputting that. Just check with your manager if you really are allowed to share that information. If you want to write anything like that, it's again a JSON file that you just populate, and the MISP will just read and use it from that point on.
And the file is based on rules, depending of the type, attribute, and so on. So, for example, if you change the rules to attributions, for example, you'll see that basically those might contain personal information. And then you have different notice depending of the type of attribute that you have. And like I just mentioned, it's basically a JSON file with rules, and you can create your own, and you can enable some parts. So if you are not bound to the GDPR, but you can just remove it, but you can add the additional one.
And once you're done, again, you can just add your attribute, and it will create a new attribute for you. Again, warning us that this one is hitting on a warning list for the same reason as the previous one.
Proposal for this one.
You
can make a proposal for this one.
Indeed, that's a good idea. So what happens if you see something that you disagree with in an event that is coming from someone else? We're again in the fortunate situation that we're logged in as a site admin, so we can use all the functionalities of MISP. That means that we can directly edit what we've just created, but we can also use it from the other perspective and propose a change to it. So we're going to just do that, and instead of using the edit button here on the right, we're going to use the propose edit button. If you click that, you get the exact same interface as an attribute edit, but it's an add proposal one. So we're going to say, okay, just remove the IDS flag from this one and propose the change. Okay, and what happened now is we created a proposal. So that's that orange marked thing. The bracket shows us what it is proposing to modify. If there's a proposal that is just a new attribute to be proposed, then you won't have the bracket around another attribute around it. What this tells us is it's exactly the same attribute as what we have in the original, but the IDS flag is set to no. And then you have the option as a user of the creating organization of this event to either say, I disagree with this or I agree with this and accept it. If you disagree with it and you click the discard button, it will delete the proposal and it is basically left as a soft deleted element in the database. However, if you accept it, what will happen is the proposal gets deleted and the actual attribute gets modified. So in this case, we've removed the IDS flag from the original. Okay?
So can you get a list of proposals for your...
Sorry?
Can you get a list of proposals for your organization?
Yes. So as a site admin, it's kind of messed up. So that will look a little bit wonky, but yes. If you click on this little mail button on top, then you have the different notifications here, and one is the proposals that you can see. Now, this is a little bit tricky because we see all the proposals since we're site admins, so we get a massive list. They're not necessarily all proposals for us. But if you're logged in as a normal user, you will only see the proposals that affect you.
Does it go to proposal to, let's say I create an IC that you guys want to propose to, did other people in my organization see that, or is it just me?
No, it's per organization. Always. Yes. And actually,
so it's something important for each event is basically bound to the organizations.
Yeah.
So that means the whole organization will see it. So it's not bound to the user. We don't carry information about the single user that basically created the event. So it's always the organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
That's a good point.
But for proposals, they're also visible to everyone. So it's not going to be in this list specifically, but if you look at an event, you will see the proposals of others, even as long as you have access.
As long as you have access to the attributes.
Yeah, exactly. If
there is a proposal that has been made by my organization that I, for example, export the MISP event to a CIRCL or whatever, what do I get if I use the API?
Okay, then it is ignored.
Do I get the
So by default is ignore. So that means the proposal itself will not appear, except in one case.
Yeah,
the one that he mentioned previously, we have parameters in MISP saying that we automatically remove the IDS flag if there is a proposal to remove it. So it's just a parameter in
But
MISP.
indeed, the downside with proposals is indeed if you're exporting to your IDS, even if you've created a proposal and you've added something, you've modified something, it will not go to your IDS. So if you want it to go to your IDS and you want to attach additional information to someone else's event, use the extended event functionality, because that one, those are actual attributes that are used for the automation. So it's basically that's a decision that you have to make whenever you have additional information or want to correct something. Do I want to create it as actual data right away under my name, or do I just want to create it as a proposal under, for example, Alexandre's name or his organization's name? But in that case, I have to wait for him to accept it. So it's
proposal is, I would say, kind of edge case usually for changing.
Yeah.
So usually use extended event, but if you really want to basically tell the others that there's something wrong, that's usually the proposal.
That's a huge advantage of it, is that it's also kind of communication with whoever created the event, because if you create an extended event, they will probably get it as well but not notice it. But if you create a proposal, they will see it as a message. They will get an email about it saying, hey, there's a proposal to something that you have created. Probably should look at that. So it might make sense to create both, actually, to just create a proposal so that to notify the other party, but also to create an extended event to have it in your IDSs directly. So yeah. Okay. So let's go back to our little event, or you want to?
Just I think 5 minutes.
Okay. So we now talked about two different ways to populate it. There is one edge case that we barely ever mentioned, or didn't for a while because we thought nobody was using it. But in some organizations, you have a lot of people that are working in help desk, for example. They're going to get emails in that they might want to share with their security team. And they will not necessarily have the necessary know-how on what kind of information should be shared, how it should be shared, what the different types and categories are, what the IDS flag is. So they don't have the means of sharing the correct information. It can be frustrating. So we have a small system that you can use for this use case, which we call the templating system. So these templates are generally created by an administrator. So they say that we expect users at our help desk to fill out this form where we describe each field, what they should put in there, and then they can, based on the use case that they're describing, just go through a simplified form. An example that we can use here is a phishing email. They get a phishing email in, they can use a phishing email form to just fill out the various fields. So here it says, for example, from address, the source address from which the email was sent. That's pretty straightforward for someone to just paste in there without having to know what category this would go into, what type it would go into, whether the IDS flag is set, and so on. All of these things are baked into the template itself. So you remove the decision-making process of contextualizing the information, and you hand it over to whoever creates the templates. So this is just something that you can use. Initially, we were just using it as kind of an internal gag because we thought it was a completely failed feature. And we just mentioned it briefly at trainings, and then we went to an organization where they were religiously using this feature. We were like, okay, so it has its purpose apparently. So I guess it also depends on the size of the organization, the number of people that get rotated in and out, so it has a lot of different aspects to it. If you want to go through that, just fill out this form, and then you're going to get all the attributes created. The good thing with this is that you can, first of all, write clear text to the users and describe what is expected of them, how to find that information. You can put that information into each of the different fields in there, and what is mandatory and what is optional. So all of this is up to you when you're creating the template. Okay.
Is there potentially a validation process behind it so that you can have somebody who says, okay, yes, I'm happy with what's in there. It is actually allowed to be shared.
Yeah, very good that you asked because I completely forgot to mention it. Yes, indeed. So generally, whenever you create data in MISP, it is not used by any tools. It is not shared. It is kept local, and that is this published flag here. So the idea is that whenever you're inputting data, you're generating all of the data that you want to share out and that you want to feed your tools with, but it is not acted upon until someone publishes it. Now, if you want to have internal processes where you want to have a senior member of your team review the data first, you can decide to hand out different roles to different users. So MISP has a very extensive role-based access control system where you can say, this user is just a regular user that can create and view data, and this user can additionally publish data. So you can separate those two aspects. And then you have your junior analyst that can just create the data, and the senior analyst does the actual publishing after vetting the data. So you can absolutely do it this way. So for example, people in the help desk could just create a lot of events using those templates, and then someone reviews them and decides, okay, this is ready for publication, it can go out. So what is the difference between a published and unpublished event? All users of an instance can see unpublished events. They can see it, so they can read the data. It will not be synchronized out to a different instance. So if you have an internal MISP instance, anything that is unpublished will stay invisible to everyone on the outside. Except that it is not going to any of the tools, and something that we will talk a little bit later on, it is not going to the 0MQ pub sub channel. So this is something that might also be interesting. If you have other tools that are hooked into MISP via pub sub channel, they will not receive the data until it is published. Okay.
We talk about delegations. Maybe
I
can do it.
Oh, sure.
Look at Attend because it's questions.
Okay.
So the thing is, when we talk about publishing, we talk about the delegations. You see that Andras select organization only. So that's meaning that the distributions will be limited to your own organizations. In the case that you don't want to share the information to everyone, you basically create your own event with the limitation to your organizations. But maybe you want to share it to third-party organizations. So what you can do, you see that you have on the left side the delegate publishing. So this one only appears on information that was never published as a different distribution than your organization only. And this one is a way to delegate the publication to a third party. And then you can select an organization. I'm taking this one, for example. And then this one will receive the event and will receive a notification. So we can even say, okay, to the target organizations that we want a specific distribution to all communities, we can send a specific message to tell to make an explanation why we want to delegate it. And then you see that the delegation request is outgoing. So CIRCL has requested that igloska.eu take over this event. And igloska, what he will receive a request of delegations that an organization is requesting that it be distributed to everyone. And then you can do an accept or a discard. Accept means that basically all the initial event is completely removed and a complete new event is created on the name of the new organization, target organizations. So it's a way to basically pseudonymize a sharing of information to that one. But this one will only appear if you have only your own organizations as distributions, because it's a bit silly to distribute information that was public at one point and then send it back as something that is basically under a different name. I will just discard it, so like that it's not accepted. Yes, I want to discard it. Okay. Then, as Andras mentioned, this event is not published. So that means that all the users from this instance can see it, but it's still not dispatched to all the other instances. So, and this has a different impact too. So when you don't publish information, it is not exportable to IDS and stuff like that. So if you, for example, go on download as, what do you see? You can still export it in different formats, but those ones are just formats that you can use to transfer information and so on, but it's not used as production information. You can, for example, get the MISP JSON format automatically. A side note to that, if we go back to the event, and if you append at the end of the event the JSON, you'll get automatically the JSON format of the event. It's very handy, because what you can do with that, you can basically take over the JSON files, go to another MISP, and import it back as is. You can even directly see the format. You can see how the format is described. The format is completely standardized. But it's and this kind of approach works on every interface in MISP. So if you go to the statistics page of MISP, and we can do that, go on this one. Yeah. So this one is basically giving the number of events. If I append .json at the end, I basically get the same page as a JSON expression. So it's very handy and nifty if you have, for example, tons of tools doing monitoring, stuff like that. You can just like point to a specific JSON. Usually the majority of pages in MISP are automatable like this. But if you have one missing, just tell us and we can extend it. So going back to our event, we are quite happy with it. We maybe need to add additional information. We can create, for example, an object. So in this case, I will take a simple object, a meaningful one. So I'll take a person object. So you see that the addition of object is exactly like attributes, except that it's basically composed of multiple attributes. You see on top that is what is required, that we need at least a first name or a last name for a person. So I take a first name, I will just try John, here's the last name, that's basically it. And then I will submit. So MISP will basically show me that how my object looks like. I have a gender that is set by default, last name, first name, and I just like say submit. So what you will see in your event is basically this object composed of multiple attributes. It's exactly the same than the MISP view with the attributes. Then I will create another object. For example, I will create a simple one. I will just take a phone. So it's basically a phone. You have all details of the phone. I can just look at what is required. At least the text. I mean, I can say that this phone has been seized from John. And then I can put a serial number just for the fun of it. And then you can basically add as much as object that you want in MISP in your event. And you see that now that you have those two objects. So now what you can do with it is you can basically do reference and cross-reference those objects, so you can create relationship. So one of the ways to do it is, for example, we take one of the objects, and you can say that this phone is, I'll take the other one, that may be easier. I'll take the persons, and I will just say that they are using this phone. And for example, I can say that this phone beacons to one of the IP addresses that Andrzej handed from Google. So that's one way to do it. Then you have a view, which is the event graph view, where you can basically see that the object itself from John, you can even expand it if we want, see what is the object behind, is basically beaconing to an IP addresses, and we see that John is using this kind of phone. So you see that from the interface itself, you can create the relationship. So you have these objects, you can create those from the user interface, or you can even create those from the graph itself. So you can even look at the one that are on reference, and you can even edit and add specific reference between additional events. Like, for example, we have this person that's basically like, I don't know, connect to or communicate with, and then you can add this additional relationship. So that's the thing that's with MISP is basically the objects are just a composition of attributes. So if I'm going back to the event, I have the different attribute, I have two objects. So I can say, like, for example, this event itself is like correct, and I want to publish it. So if now I'm going back to publish, I have different way of publishing. I have a publish event, which is automatically what it will do. It will publish the event and send email notifications, which is usually what you do when you have a first event with a lot of information and you want to publish it directly. I imagine that you have a brand new report with a lot of information, you do that. If you do some minor changes and so on, you can even publish it without email notifications. I will do this because it's basically minor things. But at the same time, when you publish, all the information in this event will be pushed to all the connection that you have with other MISP. So that's really the starting point. When you publish information in MISP, it will be basically replicated to the other MISP and all the communication that you have. This instance is connected to internal instance that we have and some external one. And depending on the distribution level and where it's going to, it will be pushed to the different MISP instances.
Did you talk about the tag filter?
We'll do afterwards.
Okay, so, we can do it later.
Yeah. So then that's the thing that is basically published afterwards. So the thing that is quite handy, and I think we have to talk about it too, it's basically if you create a new attribute, creating a new network activity with an IP destinations, I create one with, again, not a very clever one, but with IDS flag. And you see automatically when you edit an event, the unpublished flag is, so the published flag is basically set to unpublished, meaning that the information needs to be republished. So everything that needs is changing the event will set the unpublished flag. Same with taggings, for example. You might have, for example, adding tags, and then you have the unpublished value set. So if I'm publishing it again, it will do again the same stuff. So that means it will synchronize with other MISP instances. It will push information. It will get updated, and so on. If I have other MISP instances pulling data from me, those one are new events, and it will be gather. In addition to that, and that's something that you have to keep in mind, when you delete information, you don't really delete the information itself. So you have what we call soft delete. And we can do it with one here. I'll just take this one. No, whoops. Yeah. Whoops. So, and this one is very important because some people might do mistakes sometimes. Could happen that you basically create an attribute containing very sensitive information. And you did a huge mistake. You publish it, and it's distributed on all the MISP instances. So you want to delete it. When you do a deletion, by default, the deletion is just setting a flag that this attribute is deleted. So meaning that if we go in the quick filter tab, we see that included deleted attribute, we still see this attribute. Meaning it will be synchronized and it will be soft deleted. So we have an option in MISP that you can enable where you basically mangle the value itself. So the delete things is still deleted, but the value will be removed from the event. Why we do that? It's to basically keep a state when we synchronize that specific attributes are deleted. If you don't do that, you don't have this state of being deleted. If, on the other hand, we permanently delete the attribute, that means this attribute will be deleted. On the other hand, if you have a soft delete, you can even restore an attribute. So it's basically unsetting the delete flag, and you get back your attributes. So don't forget, when you delete something, the first step with MISP and the synchronization and so on is basically we just soft delete and tell the user that this attribute is deleted.
There's a protective measure that you can enable server-wide, which basically says that if an event has never been published, it will hard delete by default, so that you can catch something before it went out and block any mistakes. Something to keep in mind also here is, I don't know if you mentioned that there are two ways of soft deletion, and depends on your server. Soft deletions by default just send out a flag that it has been deleted. However, there is also one that also mangles the data.
Yeah.
You mentioned it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No worries.
Never mind. Yeah.
So then something that is quite important, because when you have an event, you might have a lot of attributes. I was just playing with a quick filter tab where we basically select included deleted event. But on the other hand, you can even basically just look at it for the things that are like, for example, correlations, proposals, and networks. So if you have a lot of events, we can select the subcategories. So for example, I don't care about all the objects that I have. I just want to see my network indicators, and I don't want to see anymore the individual. It's a bug.
Mm-hmm. You can't unset it.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you fill
GitHub
the
issue?
report?
Yeah.
Okay, first bug found. Usually it's faster, but okay. So, and that's very handy. For example, like proposal, if you have outgoing proposal, and if you have like, I don't know, 2,000 attributes, you just want to see the proposal, you just do a quick filter. Something else that is, I think, quite useful, when you start to have a lot of correlations and you start to navigate through all the different attributes and correlation and different events, you might get lost. You know the story when you go on Wikipedia, you start on one page and you end up on Marilyn Monroe page. It's basically the same kind of thing with MISP. But what you can do in MISP is, if you see here a kind of navigation point. So if I'm navigating back to that event, I still have the complete distributions where I was going to. So, and that's usually when you do a lot of analysis and so on, you can still keep track of where you have been, what kind of information you have seen, and so on. And then you can even remove it afterwards if you say, okay, this one is a dead end and I don't want to go anymore to that one, but you can keep track. So if you do reporting afterwards, you can basically just show the thread report where you have been. And I think we have to, yeah. Okay.
So we continue after lunch breaks. How long should we take?
So we start at 1:30.
Is it not? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1:30 we continue then. So lunch is served just outside on the side there. So see you all in
a
few minutes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.